Good morning, everyone. My name is Hassan Naqvi. I'm a commercialization officer at Cleveland Clinic in their technology licensing arm, known as Cleveland Clinic Innovations. I'll be moderating this session on patenting life. I'd like to start by thanking our distinguished panel for joining us today. Just as by way of introduction, we're joined by Professor Craig Allen Nard, who's previously been introduced by Dean Koo. Bratislav Stankovic, who is a scientist by training, a biologist by training, went into IP law and now is a bioethicist. And also, he serves as an advisor to the President of the Republic of Macedonia on science and technology affairs. And then we have Dr. Joe Jankowski, who is a chemist by training and an associate vice president of technology management at the Technology Transfer Office at Case Western Reserve University. Gentlemen, welcome, and thank you for joining us. I come from a science background myself, and whenever I've gone to a scientific or a medical symposium, the presenters always start with a brief background about themselves going back to their childhood. And it's usually something, it's this one event that everyone can point to. It was watching an episode of MASH that convinced them that they wanted to be a surgeon. It was looking at a grasshopper, watching life, or the first time they looked through a microscope. That convinced them that they wanted to be a scientist, and so on and so forth. I think we over here in technology transfer and in IP law, we come with a number of interests, and we come from a variety of backgrounds. And I'd like to ask the panel to take a brief moment to talk about themselves, how they ended up in the field that they ended up with. We have two molecular biologists and an expert in intellectual property law. And I think it would be something really interesting. Certainly when I was a child, I didn't think that, boy, I'd really like to grow up and become a technology transfer professional. So with that said, I'd like to start with Professor Nard, if you could say a few words.
Sure, no, my pleasure. When I think about this, it's always so humbling because students today are so much more sophisticated than when I was a student. The way I got into patent law, which is my main focus, is in college, my junior year. I thought I was going to get a PhD in polymer chemistry. That's where I was going. But I was absolutely horrendous at lab. As I tell myself, I blew things up and that sort of thing. But I really liked the bookwork. And I had a physics professor who saw me walking across the quad one day, I guess forlorn. He asked me what was going on. And I said, it's polymer stuff. You know, just got out of lab. And I don't know, I dropped something. My lab partner doesn't want to be with me anymore, you know. And I said, I don't know what I'm going to do. He said, well, do you like the theory of it all? I said, yeah, it's great. And he said, what about patent law? This was 1986. And I said, patent law? What is that? And believe it or not. And so I had a sense of what it was. And then so I did some research into it. And it was that brief, fortuitous encounter that prompted me to delve into the law a bit and do some research. And that got me on my path, my legal career. And then after I was graduated from law school, I started my career as a patent litigator in Dallas, Texas. And there I was asked to teach as an adjunct at a law school, which I gladly accepted just to put my foot into the water, and loved it. And never looked back after that. I left practice after 4 years of litigating and entered the academy and have been there ever since.
So I grew up in Macedonia, former Yugoslavia, and back in the last century I came to the United States to acquire a PhD in molecular biology at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. And then I was a scientist. I thought that was going to be my career path. I thought I was going to be in the lab pipetting small volumes of transparent fluids ad infinitum. I'm glad my thumb does not miss that motion anymore, I have to say. And then I got my first grown-up job at the University of Wisconsin back in 1999. I established a lab and a research program and was leading a program funded by NASA to develop technologies for flying plants in space, in microgravity conditions. And we had 5 experiments on the space shuttle and on the space station, growing plants and looking at gene expression patterns and that. We had 2 experiments on Columbia, the shuttle Columbia, when it blew up in 2003, and that was a turning point for me. At that time, I was already going to law school as a part-time student, and and just quit the academia. I finished law school and became a patent attorney, a patent prosecutor. So I was able to blend my biotechnology background together with my patent law knowledge, and practiced patent law in Chicago for Brinkshofer for 5 years. I was also teaching at Loyola at that time. And then on my own, I became interested in ethical issues, in scientific ethics, in bioethics, and I also have to give credit to some great teachers that I had at the University of Wisconsin, Alta Shara and Pilar Osorio, and they exposed me to some of the bioethical issues that have kept my interest to date. And I guess to put this together, I have only one explanation, and that is the law of gravity, which somehow combines my science and my legal background into one.
So it seems like we have a panel of recovering scientists. Just before Dr. Jankowski goes on, I'd just like to mention the first time I saw Dr. Jankowski and the first time I met with him, I could have sworn that he was an inventor. He was a faculty member in molecular biology or chemistry or something like that. And imagine my surprise when I found out that no, he's a technology licensing professional as well. And then, of course, I had to hear his story. So
yeah. Then I opened my mouth and he realized I wasn't smart enough to be a scientist. Actually, I probably at a earlier age than most. I was probably in my first year of graduate studies and said, I love science, but it's the medium I want to work in, but I don't want to be a scientist, similar to what you've heard, living behind a bench, but probably more so having to write grants for a living just didn't seem like a lot of fun. And it doesn't pay very well. So I knew within those early years that I loved science. I love the interface of utility between science and technology, and then with it what that impact it has on mankind, and quickly recognized that I probably should go get a public policy or an MBA, and that's what I did. In lieu of the traditional postdoc, came straight to a full-time MBA program, and then joined the crazy world of I went a little too far, trying to value early stage intellectual property and quantitatively value through, everything from spreadsheet analysis and Black-Scholes options through Monte Carlo simulations. And now 10 years later, you look back and say, boy, was that a ridiculous exercise. But I think it's the same thing that probably ultimately drives everybody who ends up in this space, as Hassan said, who ultimately kind of lives on that interface between technology and business and law, is that we do like that fringe in which we can actually see things exchanged between the different disciplines or the different industries, if you will. And it's an important it's probably an important reason that hopefully we can also view patents, as we will on this panel, as what is their utility relative to what is the discipline under the lens under which they must be viewed to ensure that they continue to serve their purpose, which is to, in many ways, as a teaching tool, to impart a novel or more so a valuable idea from the ultimate technical creator to society.
All right, gentlemen, thank you very much. We'll get into this discussion, but before we go on, I'd just like to ask the audience to please hold their questions till the end of this session, at which point we'll open the panel up for questions. Please wait, that we have a pair of lovely assistants who are holding microphones, so once you're called upon to ask a question, please hold on for them to get to your position and ask the question. So, Professor Nard, I'd like to start with the question, why is there so much focus on all these lawsuits with life science patents? Chakrabarty came along in 1981, and the Supreme Court decided that a living organism, a bacteria in that case, if I remember correctly, it was made under the hand of man, and the fact that it was a living organism did not matter much. It was patentable subject matter. And I thought, to my limited knowledge, that had solved that question for the ages. But why is this focus on lawsuits now?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, a couple things come to mind. Excuse me. You recall in Chakrabarty that one of the objections to patenting life, I mean, before Chakrabarty, it was questionable whether you could patent life, although you could make a case for it. At that time, one of the arguments was that if the Supreme Court were to say that Ananda Chakrabarty's bacterium were patentable, eligible to be patented, that would lead to a parade of horribles. And I think that a lot of people were concerned that once we lend a property right to life, even though we're not talking about multicellular organisms at this point, that would incentivize sort of the Frankenstein scenario. And Chief Justice Berger's response to that at the time was, well, look, no matter what we do in this space, people who want to sort of be outliers are not going to be deterred by what we do here today. And he kept his eye on the ball in Section 101, and just as a matter of law and policy, there's no reason why life should not be patentable, right? The distinction is between naturally occurring substances and non-naturally occurring substances, not life and not life. So that was one thing. And at that time, of course, the biotech revolution, the Genentechs, the Amgens, recombinant DNA, all these things were percolating. Bidol was around that time, and the biotech industry was about to take off. And I think the Supreme Court was aware of that. As time went on, the promise of biotechnology became greater and greater. And then the human genome initiative began, and the sequencing of the genome began, and all of a sudden you had people like Craig Venter and the like saying, "We'll start patenting genes." And that just sort of rubbed people the wrong way, not only in the United States, but particularly in Europe, as to say, well, wait a second, isn't a gene something that's fundamental? Isn't that the fundamental building block of life? But the Patent Office and the Federal Circuit saw it differently, and said, no, as long as you have human intervention, as Chakrabarty said, you have an isolation and purification, then it's non-naturally occurring. And so thousands of patents issued on genes, and I think at this point, people who are sitting on the sidelines waiting for an opportunity to challenge this type of patenting, because there are many who sincerely believe that the patent on a gene is nothing more than a patenting on a naturally occurring substance. They're waiting for the right vehicle to challenge it. And they found Myriad and the BRCA genes. And Myriad, and Robert I think could speak to this more, is not the most sympathetic patentee, right? The way, and I don't say this because of the subject matter that they patented, it's just the way they went about commercializing it. In Europe, in particular, it was either naive or under poor counsel. They didn't have a complete understanding of the public health policies that dominated Europe. They were somewhat heavy-handed, what's been called sort of fortress IP. Their claims are exceedingly broad in some sense, the method claims in particular. And also one could argue that certainly in Europe they sort of played into the fears of women's health a bit. And all of that made them an easier target than, say, Genentech or Amgen, other biotech companies. And so I thought that just there are a number of issues that align that allowed the Public Patent Foundation and others to challenge the BRCA genes. And because it's high profile and Myriad is unsympathetic. And I think that's why we're seeing more of it now.
So several questions come from that, and Dr. Jankowski will go into the business aspects, the Amgens and the Genentechs of the world. Would that have been possible had there not been Chakrabarty, or had this legal protection not been given? But before that, I'd just like to call on Dr. Stankovic and ask, Professor Nard had just brought up this point that Myriad is not a very sympathetic patentee. So how do we fix that? Is litigation, specifically litigation in this IP field, the right way to make companies behave in a proper way or in a more sympathetic way?
I wouldn't I wouldn't advise litigation as the first tool to resolve this tension that exists in the system. There's many other ways, some that have to do with the scope of the patents and with what we call patenting life, and others that have to do with the licensing principles, and third, regulatory principles that may be implemented in order to somehow find a balance in these issues. And I would also like to mention that with respect to patenting life, we use that term fairly broadly today, and we sometimes we start with Chakrabarty as a beginning of the biotechnology and the patenting life period. But I think that that is the patents on life have existed for a long period of time. It's an old hat, and a patent on yeast as an article of manufacture was granted to Louis Pasteur back in 1873. I don't know whether that claim would be allowed today, yeast as an article of manufacture, but nonetheless, it's a eukaryotic organism that was patented. There's also other patents on animals and plants they're being allowed, and I will address some of the problems that exist, particularly in Europe. Europe has a special a legal directive on the patentability of biotechnology-related inventions, and so I'm going to talk about some of those problems.
Sure. Dr. Jankowski on business aspects of it.
Yeah, it would be really easy, and it would be nice to be able to say sure. If you weren't allowed to patent life, to put it bluntly, then we wouldn't have Amgen and Genentech and that. But I don't really know if it's that simple. I mean, it's what you really. But the extremes are okay. On one hand, right? If you can't patent life, we wouldn't have these companies. Again, I don't believe that's true. On the other hand, you need to have sort of free and complete ability to patent anything you want, and and there shouldn't be any concern over some gene patents, et cetera, and I don't think that's true either. I think the reality of it is that if you look at, take one of, again, Amgen and Genentech are often held up as two of the earlier and most successful, true biotechs that actually grew to the stage of, being considered pharmaceutical companies today. They weren't, particularly in Amgen's case, Genentech a little bit more so, but Amgen didn't exactly hold a bunch of intellectual property of early stage genes, et cetera, that they exploited. I mean, if you look at the cash flows to Amgen, if you look at their top line, that is driven by sales of products that, even in the most aggressive anti-patenting of life stance would not be affected. Either synthetic, proteins, et cetera, that they've brought, EPO and some others. So you sit there and say, well, no, the impact on industry isn't necessarily dire. I think the fact is, anytime you talk about a material change to the way patents are granted, and with it the way business can be carried forth, you start to have concern. My gut instinct is that if tomorrow we had closure and complete clarity, and the USPTO was no longer going to provide or allow patents on any genes and invalidated all that exist, et cetera, you would have immense turmoil and change for short term, but I think ultimately business then would adapt and go forward. That certainly doesn't mean I'm advocating such a stance. I think it's kind of funny, even the term you say patent life, and the sort of the visceral response by many is, oh, of course you shouldn't patent life. And as Branislav said, first of all, that's been done for years, but secondly, again, if you look back at the foundation of patents, and you say, well, they're teaching tools. We want people to impart on society things that are novel, non-obvious, of course, and mostly useful. Well, then why not life above everything else, right? What can be more important than us to say, certainly, if you have some insight into the way, we can understand life and potentially cure disease or improve life, why not give up that 19, that 21 years, whatever it ends up being, towards that end? So, I think both sides are playing the extreme. I always liken it to vegetarianism. You sit there and say, why are some people vegetarian while others aren't? And there's never a simple answer, right? Some people are vegetarian for ethical reasons. Some people are vegetarian for health reasons. Some people are vegetarian because they had a really bad experience eating meat. And there's never one given faction, but collectively you say, well, there's a movement towards this end, and there's a huge population who believes this. And I think we're looking at the same thing today, because there isn't a single factor in sort of the resistance to patenting life that you can point to and say, sure, certainly that's clear. As Craig said, I think the fear is that sometimes it's the parade of horribles that drives that, or it's that cascade of, well, if you can do this, you're going to patent, my DNA, and you're going to make, someone's going to make a baby of me, and they're going to sell me parts, and you get to some real slippery slope type activities, and those that again get muddled in with a group that have many more tangible or legitimate reasons for wanting to draw the line in certain places. But to quickly go back to the first answers, I do think that there still is room for, DNA-based and in genetic therapy-based diagnostics, genetic therapies and diagnostics, regardless of how the law shakes out. But we need to be really careful to understand what changes will impart on on the short term, and in the short term basis being, a decade. And I think that's what, hopefully people like this and more so law professionals will start to sort out over the next few years.
So can I add something to that? I mean, one way to approach this is to ask what's broken, right? And I'm not so sure we could say with confidence and point to something in particular and say within the legal system as it approaches the life, as it relates to the life sciences, that something is broken. So there's very little we know, unfortunately, about how the patent system relates to general economic welfare. But at the micro level, we do know certain things empirically. We do know that pharma and biotech rely quite heavily on the patent system, right? That we do know through in-depth survey evidence. And then you say, well, I know we're going to get into this, but are deals not getting done? Is there something wrong with the current system? And if we cannot point convincingly to evidence that there is something wrong and why, then you have to ask yourself, what are we doing? So you have to retreat. So what is then the objection? Is the objection purely doctrinal in patent law? Is there something in Section 101, the eligibility provision, that is just being misread? Is it just purely a legal argument that these things should not be patented? Is it an ethical argument? Is it a policy-driven argument? It cannot be, it seems to me, at this point of what we know, a very persuasive economic argument, right? So we have to fall back on other types of arguments. And I think that's where the debate should be.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And you bring up a very good point, together with what Dr. Jankowski said about the parade of horribles and this visceral response that people have, that we're going to have patents and somehow we're going to deny medication and the benefits of healthcare to people in the third world or people who can't afford it, or that somehow this is going to validate a new concept of slavery, even, where somebody can patent technology whereby you could have clones, and then you're dragging around your clone for replacement organs. And I'd like to open up the discussion to that, starting with you, Dr. Stankovic. Like, it seems like this backlash towards or against patenting life, it's, as Professor Nard pointed out, it's hard to pin down what kind of a debate it is, because it all seems so visceral.
It does, and a lot of the backlash has to do with what I call myth versus reality. So there's misperception, and that is conveniently and usefully being used by some well-funded nonprofits and other interest groups to attack other well-funded nonprofits who own the patents, and sometimes I think for reasons that have to do more with money than anything else, probably the calculation has been made that it's cheaper to recruit non-profits that will attack the patents rather than pay a license. And I don't know whether we will be here today if Myriad was charging $300 for the test rather than $3,000 for the BRCA tests. But going back to that notion that a lot has to do with myth versus reality, the parade of horribles and patenting, equating patents on genetic inventions with owning life, patenting life and owning life. I don't think we have any reason to worry about such irrational fears, nor do we have any substantial empirical evidence that would somehow support notions that patents on life, on DNA, hinder research and development. They hinder our access to drugs, or I'll even take the plunge where they hinder future genetic tests. So in contrast, I think on the flip side, one can say that, look, we have had the benefits of many medications that have been patented, and insulin, erythropoietin, human growth factor 8, other medications that are the result of patents on recombinant DNA have been utilized by the society, by all of us. And my question would be, if the biotech companies are not given patents and are not given this monopoly for a limited period of time, then who would pick up the tab of $1 billion, $2 billion R&D per useful drug? So that's a question that I would pose. Also, patenting life equals owning life. I don't think allowing a patent on a gene or on a single human gene would lead to ownership or to slavery or to anything of that. Even if one entity was given ownership of all the human patents, I don't think that putting them together would somehow create a human and would therefore create a clone or something that would justify the fears of
So would you say that there's an ethical imperative almost to use patents as a vehicle for bringing therapies and bringing a better quality of life to the general population?
Well, I don't know whether we can frame it as an ethical imperative, but I would try to somehow reduce the ethical component here. Surely there's ethics that is related to patentability and ethics related to licensing, if you want, of these patents, and probably there should be some modicum of ethical review even in the patent office, but I don't think that we should describe it some significant importance, and I don't think that patent law is the appropriate forum for addressing ethical and moral issues.
Okay.
It's interesting because, to his point, is it's hard to frame exactly, what's driving the objection, and he pointed sometimes it may be monetary. Certainly ethics come into play. One thing you look at in many industries is you try to look at the extremes and say, is there something out of whack with the way we understand business acts? So, for instance, you see a lot with the public response to big oil. And they say, look at these profits. This is obscene. They brought in, $13 billion last year in profits. They brought in $86 billion. It's just, it's sort of, there's unmitigated profit here. There must be, we need to put some control to put things back in perspective. Similarly, you'll see the other extreme in medicines where you may point to the fact that there is an immense hurdle due to litigations for companies to take things forward and profit. And as Branislav said, if you were reading constantly about a company being sued out of business and no longer having to be able to bring a product to market or to a patient, you would then say, okay, again, there's an extreme. It's very hard here because for us, and recognizing, absence of proof is not proof of absence. There isn't an immense amount of profit going on in the biotech space. The patents that will most likely be at risk if the current challenge is upheld, and those that are probably considered the most nefarious by those who feel that you shouldn't be able to patent life are not the bolus of a very profitable industry. It's kind of ironic that Myriad is the target, because Myriad is one of the only groups that even makes money in the diagnostic space. When a company comes to us, or when an inventor comes to us and says, I've got this potential diagnostic, we recognize that, certainly we may consider patenting, but the default is it's probably not going to be very valuable. Many have not been able to take, companion diagnostics, as they're called, to the market and make any money. And so again, you would think that, like when we met previously on the phone to discuss this panel, if there was an immense amount of groups saying, look at these groups, the Big Ten are profiting and making billions, and meanwhile no one else can bring anything to the patient, you could see them saying these patents are being abused. When the fact seems to be the other way, that the cost of capital is extreme and most of these companies are losing money, you sit there and say, well, what would be, to Craig's point, what would be the benefit if today suddenly these patents were gone? Do we believe there would be ample access to patients? And in fact, there was a reason I was looking up, doing my homework for this panel a few days ago, a well-written article, I think it was New York Times or that, by the spouse of a woman with breast cancer, saying, all I want for Christmas is for them to, uphold the Southern District Court in New York, whatever's ruling against Myriad, because she was diagnosed with breast cancer a few years ago, and they found the BRCA gene, et cetera, and it's all great, but this was a very, if we had to pay a lot of money, et cetera, and to Branislav's point, I'm thinking, there may not have been a bracket test on the market if you didn't provide an economic return to give somebody, 10 or 20 years, figure probably less than 10 once it's actually in the market, exclusivity. They're just going to assume that, oh, great, there would be 10 products and they'd all be cheaper. It would be a commodity, when in fact, you may have removed all the value or the incentive for a company to develop it. And I really think, to Craig's point again, is there is not any convincing argument that there is a hindrance to innovation because of patents. And certainly, I see, a really, really, really small niche, but my little grab sample of the world is, in 11 years, I've seen one, would-be company that would have been financed and would go forward with a medical product close its doors because of blocking IP. And it was not in the genetic space at all. It was a medical device. But that was one time. And you sit there and say, look at all the hundreds that have, failed for other reasons. And so you, again, looking at the increment or the return, what do we really gain? Unless it's just an ethical, unless it's just a complete ethical argument, it doesn't seem to those tied to business to feel that there would be any real upside to the patient care.
Mr. Narv, would you like to add anything to that?
No, not at this point.
Oh, okay. So we have been we've been talking about this, and obviously we've been framing the discussion so far on more of a national stage, on a U.S. stage. Dr. Sankovic, I'll call on you to kind of talk to us about what's happening on a more global stage. You had pointed out that you were going to talk about TRIPS and some of the things like that.
Right. So we sometimes we can focus on the United States, but I think lessons can be learned from looking at how this issue is handled in different jurisdictions, and also the inconsistency that exists, and what should we do on a global level to provide some harmony and consistency in treating these issues. And so in Europe, for example, I'll start with a couple of cases: the Harvard Onco mouse and the Upjohn transgenic mouse. And so there are two inventions on a transgenic animal, transgenic mouse. The Harvard Onco mouse was the patent on the Harvard Onco mouse was challenged before the EPO, and a patent was granted. And it was challenged, among other things, on the ground of ordre public and morality. And the European patent law has a provision for compliance with ordre public and with morality. We don't have that in the United States. And so the opposition division used a utilitarian balancing test and looked at the invention as a whole, the mouse as a whole, and the utility, the benefit that it was going to provide, and the balance that against the fear that it would be contrary to moral or the public, and said that, in the end, we have here a transgenic mouse that can be used to cure cancer. We should allow patent on that. In contrast, there's a different transgenic mouse, hairless mouse, the Upjohn mouse, and a patent was not allowed in the European Union on that, even though it had the utility of being used as a model system for studying boldness, and I support that as I age. But now the opposition division of the EPO said no, that's not enough to pass the threshold of this utilitarian balancing test, and so that's that. Then we have the case of relaxin, a hormone that was also patented in Europe, and an array of challenges was brought against relaxin. Some of them on morality grounds, that it was somehow being extracted from pregnant women, etc. But none of that was sufficient to invalidate the patent on that.
So there's been this one of the other aspects of this debate is the North-South divide or the East-West divide on a global scale, that the West or the technologically advanced countries, or whatever you want to call them, will patent all this technology and somehow deny its benefits presumably to the developing world. An example is of medications. There's always someone or the other talking about cheap medication or cheap therapies for malaria and for tuberculosis and so on and so forth that evil corporations are supposedly keeping from, or evil countries for that matter, are keeping from the poor of the world because of their bottom line. And I just wanted you to comment on that. Like, surely the world and world bodies, the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, have thought about that.
Surely they have. The developed countries would like to keep tighter intellectual property rights and stricter intellectual property rights. The developing countries, like the developed countries before them, are trying to have lax standards and to be able to copy some of the technologies. The TRIPS agreement is supposed to somehow resolve the tension that exists between those two groups of countries, and in particular, with respect to medications, to providing some cheaper medication technologies for generic drugs in the developing countries. And the TRIPS agreement does provide mechanisms for compulsory licensing, and it allows countries based on health and safety concerns to grant compulsory licenses to entities in their countries, and I think it's a fairly well structured language there. The TRIPS agreement also provides the minimal standards for protection of intellectual property rights in individual countries, and I think that it's fairly broad, provides patentability of all inventions in all areas of technology, and sometimes there's a conflict even between the European Biotechnology Directive that says you cannot patent animals and plants, and I think that violates one of the TRIPS articles, Article 27, for example. And so I think a lot of interesting work can be done in trying to resolve the conflict that exists between TRIPS and individual patent laws that exists in individual nations.
Could I just add one thing to Bratislav's comment about TRIPS? The issue in TRIPS now is providing access to meds to countries that don't have domestic manufacturing capabilities. And the pharmaceutical industry learned its lesson in the South African debacle of the late 1990s. And the issue, as Bratislav said, there is a fairly robust, although cumbersome, compulsory licensing clause in Article 31 of TRIPS. But if you had domestic manufacturing capability like India or Brazil, excuse me, you could invoke it for domestic consumption. What happened is that in 2005, when many of the more sophisticated developing countries like India and Brazil had to buy into patent protection on products, drugs, they no longer could export. And so countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, that do not have domestic manufacturing capability can no longer call India up and say, make these drugs for us. Mm-hmm. And this is an issue. And the Doha ministerial round in TRIPS addressed this particular issue. And there's currently a waiver in place in Article 31F that says that if you don't have domestic manufacturing capability, you can invoke this waiver and call a country, Dr. Reddy in India, and say, ship this. And that waiver is meant to ultimately be an amendment to TRIPS, would be the first amendment to TRIPS. Only one country, Rwanda, has so far invoked that waiver, and this is a mystery of sorts. But the waiver exists, and the amendment has been ratified by the northern countries, but many of the southern countries in Africa have not ratified it. And people are wondering why. What's going on here?
Are there any theories, or?
There are a couple of theories. I mean, one theory is that NGOs are more powerful now than they were when TRIPS was negotiated. One theory goes that they're whispering in the ear of the developing countries saying you could get a better deal. I think a lot of people are skeptical of that. The other theory is that there's concern, and I think this is more plausible, about retaliation from pharma. That if you invoke this, pharma and the North can retaliate in other ways if you do this. But what I don't understand, I think, and I've talked to others who are closer and more active in this space, is that the North has already signed on, and it's already ratified, and this is probably the best deal that you're going to get. And the waiver is very cumbersome because Northern pharmaceutical companies are very concerned about parallel importation and arbitrage. But that's been addressed in the waiver and ultimately the amendment. So that issue we've come a long way from the mid-1990s to now on the access to meds issue. The other thing I would make about access to meds is that IP is an important part of that issue, but it's a small part. The other part relates to delivery mechanisms. It relates to poverty. If you have a large, poor, developing country, sometimes it will cost a month's wages to make it to Doctors Without Borders to get access to meds, for instance. And so, if you talk to people at GSK, GlaxoSmithKline, they'll say, look, we're making this available, but that's only part of the battle. How do you get it to the people who need it most? So it's a very complex issue. IP, as Joe said, big pharma is an easy target. But we're seeing more patent pooling, more donation into pools. So we're trending in the right way in that regard. And just one more point about the onco mouse. The Canadian Supreme Court not too long ago invalidated the Harvard onco mouse patent. And if you read that opinion, it is largely an ethical opinion. Now, of course, there's a statutory provision there, eligibility provision in Canadian patent law that essentially parallels that of the American provision. Chakrabarty was discussed in that opinion, and it was found wanting in terms of being persuasive, and that was an important pronouncement by the Canadian Supreme Court.
Just to close up the argument over here, Dr. Jankowski, from a business perspective, I don't suspect that mandatory licensing gives you sleepless nights, that it's going to cut into your bottom line. But let's say that an inventor at case comes up with a revolutionary new technology to cure malaria, knock that out. Obviously, the demand for that medication or that therapy would be outside the United States and in lesser developed countries. But at the same time, there is this demand to develop this technology and bring it to the fore. So in the context of mandatory licensing, how would you handle a situation like that?
Well, it's interesting because, again, I probably need to think this out more, but to me, mandatory licensing has some elements that are rather attractive. It takes away the doomsday scenario where people are saying that, you have this pot of gold that you won't share with the rest of the world for evil capitalistic reasons. Now, of course, it also gives me sleepless nights in that it's a very strong intervention that really greatly reduces the strength of patents across all disciplines, et cetera. But I would argue, and it was I wasn't thinking about it until the two speakers brought it up, is that when we talk about the ethics, which again clearly may not be the only reason, but is an important one in this debate, there is just and Craig earlier also mentioned, the whole idea that Myriad wasn't a very sympathetic patentee. There is that approach to it, so you don't necessarily need a legally based change, but rather you need people to act more ethically, and maybe that's where the lobby should be rather than in asking the courts to weigh in. And I will tell you that at Case, that is very, very, it's in our collective thoughts constantly when we have a new invention. And I'll give you a more discrete example, starting with, I don't know the exact year, but basically the African access to HIV drugs was, I believe, Yale's alumni sued Yale over what they've considered, nefarious approach to licensing the technology to big pharma without ensuring access to poorer countries. And that's not lost on us. We, in the last 2 years, have a thermally stable insulin. At this stage, just a bolus of patents. This certainly is years away from being a product in clinical demonstration, but very exciting nonetheless. This would be a synthetic, recombinant insulin, so it certainly wouldn't be, restricted by any of the debate that we're talking about today. Nonetheless, we've sat there many times, as high as, with provost and president saying, with the myriad of potential opportunities around this technology, it's again probably the most exciting technology I've seen in 10 years. We, above all, cannot let this in any way be a negative to the university. We hope we make money. We hope it gets out there, et cetera. but we cannot afford for this to be anything other than a positive. And we've talked about that, because when you talk about a thermally stable insulin, you talk about insulin already being a multi-billion-dollar market worldwide. And that market, you know, to no surprise, is pretty much in the U.S. and Western Europe, and as well as, you know, developed Asia. Insulin, you know, obviously is a treatment for diabetes. Diabetes is not restricted to only the rich countries, and in fact, it's a scourge in you know, the poor countries. The problem is they don't have refrigeration, and insulin needs constant refrigeration. So there is no treatment for diabetes in sub-Saharan Africa. So when this technology was created, and actually the Gates Foundation talk really kicked off our inventor's idea for this. You know, he said he went home to his hotel and couldn't sleep, and I said, what can you really do for the world? He said, it's hard to believe that in 20 years, insulin hasn't progressed from where it was, you know, in the 80s. And there's got to be a way with modern technology to make something that's, you know, thermally resistant. And sure enough, he did it. Well, you know, this has huge opportunity particularly in the Middle East as well, where it's very hot, and they have a huge problem with diabetes. Prevalence getting as high as 1 in 5 by 2025 in Africa. The flip side is there's huge money just in the U.S. I mean, this would be a Rolls-Royce insulin product, right? You know, you travel, you could keep it in your glove compartment. You don't have to throw out as much. Hospitals would love it. So immediately we were faced this case saying there is a huge Western market for this. And there's also huge utility in the South. In fact, I'll give you one more anecdote because it's just too good to not state. When the technology hit the cover of the Journal of Biochemistry, or I think it's called, anyway, Journal of Biochemistry, we'll call it, about a year ago, an unsolicited, somebody the inventor never met, who's a National Academy of Science member, wrote at the time Condoleezza Rice and said, this is the type of technology that we need to use in foreign relations to show that the Western investment in medicine and that helps all. So it's a, you know, it's a huge profile, and you know, I guess I'm proud to say that as the patentee, we are very cognizant of the need for wide dissemination. You know, and it doesn't mean we don't hope to profit financially from the technology, but it doesn't need a change. You know, we wouldn't expect I wouldn't expect as a citizen for the patent office to ensure that type of restriction. I would suggest that patentees need to hold that responsibility, and you know, so again, certainly I favor allowing that to be held at the level of the owner rather than a change in law.
So I'm going to take just a few minutes to take the discussion into a more of a research and academic sense. When I was in graduate school, as you were Dr. Jankowski and Dr. Stankovic, and you too, Professor Nowell.
I was aspirational. I was dropping test tubes.
You probably dropped the cure for cancer.
Exactly.
So during our research, all of us had to read a lot of papers, and you know, they talk about these experiments and these nice little results, and then you go to the materials and methods sections, and oftentimes they would punt it back to an earlier publication, which would punt it back to an earlier publication, which would punt it back to another publication, and the protocol would be lost somewhere. That is not the case in patents. In a patent application, everything has to be listed out, the recipe, how you do it, almost to the point of the secret sauce, or you know, that little thing that somebody does to make the magic happen. So to my mind, it's mind-boggling to me why, as graduate students, we didn't refer to patent applications to do certain experiments, and yet there it is. It's this tremendous teaching tool to further science and scientific research, and hopefully bring the benefits of scientific research out to society. But is that enough? I mean, is that enough to justify the existence of patents? I mean, together with we've talked about business, and we've talked about the research ability. But Professor Nard, I'd like you to talk about the role of patents as in teaching and in progressing of science.
Certainly, one of the traditional justifications for the existence of a patent right has been its disseminative disclosure function. Right? So it's a teaching tool. There are other justifications, but just to focus on this one in particular, that is a bit overstated, I think, right? Because and it varies by industry. The theory, of course, is, but for the prospect of a property right, the inventor will most likely withhold its invention as a trade secret unless reverse engineering is very easy, right? And certainly in the life sciences it is. And certainly in the small molecule chemistry space it is. So some people may disclose anyway. But then you have to talk about the extent of the disclosure, right? So the law says that you have to disclose in a way that enables persons having ordinary skill in the art to make and use it. It's a fairly low bar. And what you would find is when you talk to people who are engaged in fairly active cross-licensing, what you will find is that the licensee typically will want more than just a disclosure. Right? And you'll say, well, why? Why is that? Here it is. You have an enabling disclosure. In the United States, we have this best mode requirement. It teaches you the best way. The licensee will say, I know there's a lot more you did not disclose, because the patent document is not only technical, it's legal. And so the licensee will typically want what's called an enabling package. You want access to the inventor. You want the tacit knowledge, the know-how that is not disclosed and not required to be disclosed in the patent document. So the teaching function of the patent is important. There's a signal there. It's enough to sort of whet the appetite, to prompt ideas on improvement, to advance the technology. But in terms of practicing the invention and getting down to the best way, the most optimal way of practicing it, typically you need more. And so the disclosure function is just one. I think the more persuasive economic justification for patents is its role in commercialization, particularly in the life science space. Because if you're going to go upstream to downstream, you're going to need access to money and other players that don't have the expertise or resources that you have at the upstream stage. And just take, and Joan Brasloff could speak to this better than I, but if you just talk about an investigator across the street here at Case, last time I checked, there's no manufacturing sales force, $500 million in the bank to take it through the FDA, et cetera. You need to attract people to the table, from angels to VC to Pfizer, all the way to the end to get it into CVS. How do you do that? And typically a patent will play in the life science space a very important role along the way to make that translation happen. And so that justification seems to be more persuasive than the disclosure justification, but you need both.
I think just almost on the flip side of whether it's sufficient, I think that it can be better utilized. I think back to a story of we had a young inventor, a biomedical engineer, come into my office a few years ago, and she had this idea for coupling two imaging technologies, or really an imaging technology with a ablation, a radiation-based ablation technology. And we'd never read about it or had any chance to to search the patent database for that. But the two immediate responses we first had was, "Wow, that's really cool," and secondly, it's hard to believe that this is novel, because I'm not an expert in this space, but this is I hope it's novel, but are you sure no one's done this before? And she said, no, the closest people are doing anything like this is at the University of Washington, where I came from, where I did my degree, but she pointed out some differences in how their approach was. And I said, but what about like Siemens or Toshiba or whatever? And she said, oh, I don't know, I don't like industry, I stay out of that world. And I said, so you didn't check the patent database? She said, no, and certainly, as you can imagine, we went there and there were literally hundreds of patents, and it was about a 10-year-old space. But the more important thing to me was that, as again, going back to the teaching tools, not for the commercial reason, not for tech transfer, but just as a researcher, I would have thought that an academic who wanted to develop a research program and expertise in that space would have been cognizant and adept at looking at what the patent database gives, just as the teaching tool, for her to say, here's who's interested, and she said, again, her exact words were, I only look at what academic researchers are doing. And I thought, but there's more research paid for by the private sector than there is in the public, if you will count the universities as public sector. And so I think that, to Greg's point, it's not enough, or it's not as efficient as it could be at the very least. And it's probably something we need to do a better job of as a law school, as a university, as just society, of recognizing because we are granting these monopolies that at times can be abused or profitable. Let's make sure we're getting our return. I never read a patent while I was going through grad school, never once. In fact, my original thesis work could have been patented. It probably wouldn't have been worth anything, but I never even considered it. It wasn't, now times have changed a bit, and certainly, it's something that I think everybody's a little more cognizant of, especially in the area of, innovation and basically the fact that we realize that it's our only true space for economic growth, with manufacturing and such no longer being part of it. But it is something I think we need to continue to do, and I think it may balance the debate over what should be patentable or not if we can in fact show that there is value towards, again, one of the original reasons for granting patents, which was to disseminate knowledge to mankind.
And to your point, it reminds me of a story from Roger Chen's group. Roger Chen, incidentally, is the researcher who won the Nobel Prize in 2008 for discovering green fluorescent protein. He's also very well known for designing and making fluorescent tracers for measuring sodium levels, calcium levels, potassium levels, which is very big in the neurosciences. And he filed a patent and got a patent on the method of use for an agent known as Indo-1, which is the standard for calcium measurements in neurobiology. And Roger Chen made this comment that, yeah, it was something sitting on the table for 6 to 8 years, and I took it, I modified it slightly, and lo and behold, we have, the standard in life sciences, which made ion flux measurements in neuroscience and, in fact, in biology in general possible. And that's driven the life science research forward by very, very rapidly. So with the time that we have left, I think we have about a few more minutes here, I'd like to kind of button down this discussion and ask the question, where do we go from here? Like, how can we make the maximal number of people happy? Do we, people are talking about patenting genes and having control over genes. So do we take away composition of matter claims in life, just leave method of use claims, or what can we do from your perspective?
Well, I think that I'll just speak from the legal perspective. From my point of view, it seems that the eligibility provision should be as broad as possible and as generous as possible. And the fights should be over novelty, non-obviousness or inventive step, and disclosure and commensurability, right? You can't claim more than you disclose. And I think the Supreme Court in Bilski certainly hinted at this and sometimes even expressly noted it, that the nature of technology to which patent law pertains is unpredictable. And you don't know what's around the corner. And it may be too aggressive simply to say X, Y, and Z are unpatentable. So let it in, and then you could talk about novelty. And then you could talk about these other doctrines. And I think that may be the best approach. I don't know that's going to make everybody happy, but it seems to be a wise approach, but I'm open to be persuaded otherwise. We do have these traditional common law filters. You can patent laws of nature, natural occurring phenomena, etc., which are fine, but there's a definitional issue there. What are these things? Like abstract ideas. The majority in Bilski, as Justice Stevens pointed out in his dissent, was hard-pressed to actually define what's an abstract idea. How do you do that? But we have them, and I think those make people feel good, actually. The other question, I'll leave it, I'll stop after this. The other question seems to me is which legal institution, patent law institution in particular, is best suited to evolve, to change the law. And I will always opt for the courts over Congress or the Patent Office, because, I mean, the Congress, unlike copyright law in the copyright space, Congress has not necessarily been as captured by public interest, by special interest as Congress has in the copyright space. But there's always that fear. Plus, there's also this notion of acting too quickly, too rashly in Congress. The courts, in their common law powers, can move the law in ways as an accretion to address issues as they come up, and that's been the patent law way for over 200 years, and that seems to have worked well. And so, if we are going to move the law, I think we have the right institution in place. I just worry that they're going to get a little too aggressive.
I can only amplify what Craig said. I completely agree with that.
Lucky I won first.
That's a disadvantage of going after you as a presenter. I should also put 101 on the back burner and try to resolve the issues in the other space, the 102, 103, 112 statutes. But also, where do we go from here? I think the concern is overemphasized, and I think we have seen that in the context of the battle over the stem cell patents, the re-examination, and we're seeing it again now. Over the battle over the gene patents is what is happening is the ownership of patents is for a limited period of time, 20 years, and if you look at the period of time during which the patents are actually used and everything else that has to take place, all the developments downstream, then those take time. We worry about patentability of something that is very fundamental, okay, like patenting genes or patenting stem cells, but we have so much precedent for patentability of other fundamental inventions, and you know, be it growing tissues in vitro, polymerase chain reaction, recombinant DNA, you name it. And we have survived, and the industry has advanced, and the industry is doing well, so I wouldn't change it in the framework of the patent system. Other regulatory agencies could contribute and could perhaps exercise higher level of scrutiny over the ethical and the moral questions that may arise, but I don't think that at present we have any foundation to be concerned. I don't think we should be acting on something that speculative that may or may not happen in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's easy to say, but a data-driven assessment of the impact of patent prohibition, the fact that you know, there are patented materials that you know, may be tied to life. If indeed those who feel that there needs to be a change at the fundamental level could provide such, it would be very helpful. Because again, at this point, we're dealing with a lot of anecdote, and it's very difficult to suggest that. Again, we can point to some negatives that would certainly come from a change in what can be patented. I don't think anybody, and if they can, you know, that voice again needs to be clear, can suggest what would be the upside of such. And it's certainly going to err to the cautious and say let's keep going with what's got us to where we are to date, and unless, you know, there is fundamental data that comes forward that suggests that we need to change. And then to Craig's point, let data change at the you know, in the courts, not in a political or administrative level.
All right, well, thank you very much for the discussion. At this time, we'll open up to questions from the audience. Any questions? And we have our two assistants holding the mic, so please hold your questions until a mic is transported to you. Please, go ahead.
Is it on? Okay. I'm not a scientist, so I apologize if I misspeak, but I have a question kind of about the growth of personalized genomic medicine, and specifically, the more that we explore this technology, especially in human-induced pluripotent stem cell research, this is going to involve human subjects and human subject material. I'm interested to know what your opinions are on whether or not the human subjects that are donating this material or taking part in the protocol should maintain a right to their property, and if so, do you think should be the extent of that? And then also, do you think the informed consent process is enough for these patients, especially when you think about the fact that a lot of hospitals you have to explicitly opt out, or they'll just take your human tissue and use it for research, and I don't think that's always clear. So I'm just kind of, for me, there's a big ethical issue there over the use of human subjects and the material from human subjects, and whether or not the person donating the material should be able to retain any property rights to their material and to what is produced from their material.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, again, realizing these are my personal opinions, yes, they should maintain rights. And in fact, as a matter of law, the FDA will not allow a waiver of financial rights for an exchange of human material. It doesn't mean that anyone's ever made profit from it, you know, because they don't know what happens downstream. So as you mentioned, with you know, there are certainly probably already interventions on the market, and certainly will be going forward, especially with the advent of stem cells, et cetera, that you have to say, look, at some point, this cell came from a populace, and they didn't retain any financial rights. There's no reason for them not to, right? You could argue that there's the only way those activities are being conducted at the early stages when they donate is through academic medical centers, right? Pfizer can't come to your door and say donate material. They're always being done under an institution with an IRB, et cetera. So administratively, you could say, here is the populace. Now, of course, you need with HIPAA, et cetera, to make sure that these people are protected. But I don't really see an argument as to why they can't be part of that. Now, you asked a much different question with is informed consent as strong as it should be? No, and it's a question of, you know, is that the fault of the practitioners, or is it the fault of the patients themselves? I mean, you know, when you try to look at the studies, people, especially informed consent in areas of, you know, access to cures, people with cancer, et cetera, they're in a desperate position where they don't care. You ask them if, you know, they sign an informed consent, they sit down with their doctor, enroller, you know, when they do the studies, you interview them 2 hours later and say, what did you know, they don't have a clue. We've certainly made huge strides at the institutional level, especially with conflicts of interest, et cetera, to ensure that there's much more transparency than there used to be. Whether you ultimately will ever get a true informed consent, you know, you may get an informed consent, you're never going to get a non-biased consent, because there is an emotional investment by the patient who wants to receive that care. So I'm a little less strongly worded here. I don't know what we can do there, but I do feel that there's no reason to decouple the donors of given technology that's derived from, you know, human material from the ultimate downstream. And it may be an area where one day they need to determine what that means. Just like in the patent world, universities have been forced to determine what is the percentage that can go to an inventor, you know, and under Bayh-Dole, the piece of legislation that allows universities to hold rights, it explicitly states that the inventors should receive a cut of what is licensed. You probably could see a similar type of, policy, at least, where donors to a given project could receive a given proportion of what the hospital may ultimately receive, if something.
Would your answer change any if we were talking about adult-derived stem cells or iPS cells at all, or would it be the same?
No, I think it would be the same.
Questions? Yes, sir. Just for the microphone.
Actually, I'm Arnold Kaplan, one of the next speakers, so I'll speak to a couple of these points, but I strongly disagree with what Joe just said, because the cornerstone of a donation of tissue or sample is de-identification. And so the de-identification process allows basic research to go on samples from individuals without personalizing them. So what you want to do is issue an economic tag to the de-identification process, which one could argue is an important part, but the actual novelty, innovation, is the process which goes after the donation of tissue. And as long as the use of that information is ethical and helps society in general, I think it's best that the de-identification process not be bridged by the economic interest of the donor. And again, this whole process that we're talking about, I have to say, the whole discussion this morning is about economics versus discovery. And economics is a barrier. The patenting is an economic barrier. The licensing is an economic barrier. I've had numerous fights with Joe on that. And
he
all
always
these
wins.
are economic issues. Not that I won many of them. Since I'm just a professor here, I'm not a university official. But the real issue for law students and for the law community is this is a theoretical construct about what patents can do, should do, have to do, the determinant of their success is economic. And so there's another complete component to that. And this barrier, I would propose that this barrier, this patenting barrier, this economic barrier, is a very good thing because it keeps the bar very high for things which are going to come into the production and dissemination process. So the point is, you asked a very complicated personal, ethical, human question, but you did it within an economic context. And as soon as you did that, it really puts huge pressure on the scientist because we want to work with de-identified samples. And I'll give you the perfect scenario, which is in the research I'll talk about. We found a sample that didn't, in one of the assays, didn't work exactly like the other 10. And eventually we got another sample of that, and we got a similar result. And it was in a mouse model for MS. And it's the patient sample. The donor was an MS patient. And we were able, by keeping confidentiality, to understand, we're not supposed to know anything about the patients, but we found out that this patient has MS. Now, we're going to jump through enormous hoops to try to talk to that patient and figure out when we got those samples and how that relates to the science that we're doing. But the barrier, let me say that it's taken us a year. We still don't know the name of the person. Right? We haven't talked to him. So that the protection of the donor is paramount. The economic aspect relative to protecting the donor's economic rights, I think have to be, in my humble opinion, subservient to the broader use of that material. Eventually there's a court case which disagrees with that, where a cell from a patient eventually led to a huge discovery. And that sets precedent. But that's the 1 in 10 billion examples of where that really was important. And eventually the courts in our system sought that out and clarified that. But in general, it's a huge problem for us who are dealing with these donated samples.
Any responses? Right. Do we have time for one more question, or? Okay, one more question. Yes.
Hello. So I appreciate the recommendations that were made that sort of mentioned the role of like professional organizations and institutions in sort of directing regulation, I guess, rather than assessing the problems with patents. So one of my questions or sort of concerns is, so within the realm of pharmacogenomics, we've already seen research being done on things like HIV, drugs for cardiovascular disease, and cancer. So that's certainly laudable, but I wonder, I guess my question is, what role does patenting genes have in promulgating the problems that we already see with the pharmaceutical industry, where some of the most popular drugs dispensed are like antidepressant medications. So certainly like researching SSRIs is a little bit different than researching HIV medications. So.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So patent law operates in a decentralized setting. So patent law is sort of atechnological and has objective standards to determine what is patentable. But it doesn't guarantee commercial success, and it doesn't indicate where one should channel their inventive energies. And so what patent law does, we leave that, patent law leaves that to the market, and it's implicit in your question. So lifestyle drugs, for instance, huge market, right? But then you have so-called if you look at so-called orphan drugs or diseases that are only a small population suffer from, the money's not there, so private industry is not going to channel their energies there, absent some other type of incentive. So should patent law be altered to increase the incentive to channel inventive energies to those particular areas? That's the gist of your question. I worry about that. I worry about, because that would be a congressional action that we would have a statute that would say you get a longer term if you channel your money here, or you have a lower threshold for patentability if you channel your energy there. I worry that the patent code will soon look like the copyright code. It will just be sort of a special interest statute. I think that Congress has and should continue to intervene through other vehicles to make research into those particular diseases more attractive. There's also a role for NGOs, Gates Foundation. These types of organizations have a role to play here. But it's an issue. I'm not so sure patent law is the best vehicle to address that issue, however.
Agreed.
All right, well, thank you very much for being part of this discussion. Thank you in particular to our distinguished panel,
Pleasure.
Professor Nard, Dr. Stankovic.